Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first webinar of 2024, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Strategy, presented by the Diversity Institute and the 50/30 Challenge. I'm Terry Campbell, the Manager of Recognition and Celebration here at WXN, and before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on, as we meet today on this virtual platform. From coast to coast, WXN acknowledges the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people who call this nation home. I'd like to personally recognize that I am speaking to you from Toronto, which is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So we do this to reflect and acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and to consider how we can each, in our own way, move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So before we move on, I'd like to really take a moment to touch on that last point. What I've learned over the last year or so is how important land acknowledgements are. They should not be seen as a mere formality in programming. Land acknowledgements are an opportunity for us to reflect on and express genuine gratitude and appreciation for the land we live on, while acknowledging its Indigenous history. It's important to view land acknowledgement as a commitment to ongoing dialogue, understanding, and learning. So I really want to thank you for taking that moment with me. Last November, we released a new report that highlighted the progress women have made in leadership positions within FP 500 companies and the long journey left to go. We noted that women hold just 34% of board roles and fewer than 25% of executive leader and C-suite positions. And while we started this conversation with a focus on gender, we also recognize that intersecting dimensions of diversity are even more significantly underrepresented in leadership. That's why, for the past 3 years, we've placed a growing focus on Canada's 50/30 Challenge, encouraging organizations across the country to commit to gender parity and significant representation of other equity-deserving groups on boards and in senior management. You'll see this alignment in our latest challenge issued in our report, that women occupy 50% of board roles and 40% of executive leadership roles, including women of color, women who are Black, Indigenous women, women living with disabilities, and members of the 2S LGBTQ+ community. That goal reaches beyond FP 500 corporations we track, because we believe that women across all dimensions of diversity deserve opportunities to grow and lead within small and medium-sized companies as well. The challenges just look a little bit different. SMEs tend to have fewer internal resources to implement broad EDI policies, launch innovative programs, and comply with new regulations. Often, it's more of an informal process. Often, it's led by a team of one, and often that person has a lot of other responsibilities in addition to ED and I. We're also at different points on our paths. Some of us are very familiar with equity, diversity, and inclusion practices, while some of us are here to learn about it for the first time. So, what's available to meet SMEs where they are along that journey and help them move forward? That's what we're here to talk about today with the help of the Ted Rogers School of Management's Diversity Institute. As a platinum partner at our Canadian Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Summit and Awards program, the Diversity Institute is a key collaborator on EDI at WXN. Founded in 1999, the Diversity Institute conducts and coordinates multidisciplinary research that promotes equity, diversity, and inclusion as the key to Canada's competitiveness. Their action-oriented, evidence-based approach is advancing knowledge of the complex barriers facing women and non-binary people, Indigenous peoples, Black and other racialized people, persons with disabilities, immigrants, and 2S LGBTQ+, and gender and sexually diverse people. The Diversity Institute is the research lead for the Future Skills Center, leads the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, and is an ecosystem partner in the Government of Canada's 50/30 Challenge. To lead our session today, we're joined by Dr. Wendy Sukier, founder of the Diversity Institute, academic director of the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, and research lead of the Future Skills Center. She is the co-author of the bestseller Innovation Nation, Canadian Leadership from Java to Jurassic, and former VP of Research and Innovation. Wendy has been recognized with the Harry Jerome Diversity Award, the Bob Marley Award, the Canada-Pakistan Business Council's Female Professional of the Year, the Metropolis Research Award, the CATA Alliance Sarah Kirk Award for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, and a WXN Canada's Most Powerful Women Top 100 Award. She has been named a YWCA Woman of Distinction, one of the International Women's Forum 2020 Women Who Make a Difference, a woman of influence, and one of the 100 alumni who shaped the century by the University of Toronto. Absolutely incredible work and such an inspiring individual. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Wendy.
Thanks so much, Terry. And whenever anyone reads my bio, it just kind of makes me feel old because it was last century, not this one. I also, before I get started, I just wanted to commend you on your introduction and how authentic your land acknowledgement was, because I agree with you 100%. We have to get beyond just saying the words and really thinking about what it means. And many of you know the university I'm at has changed its name, in fact, as part of its commitment to truth and reconciliation. And I would really encourage people on the call, if they haven't already, to look at the TRC's recommendations and think about which ones might apply in your context and which ones you might think about embedding in the work that you do. Because, as Terry said, all of the work, whether we're looking at truth and reconciliation, whether we're dealing with gender bias, anti-Black racism, transphobia, all of the work requires both commitment and action. And I think we've got a great collection of people here and a great partnership with WXN to move this forward. And if anyone was at their last awards event, it's so clear that the organization has really transformed and reinvented itself. And the commitment to intersectionality, when we look at the experience of women, I think is very evident in everything that WXN does. So I just wanted to thank you very much at this time for all the work that you do and for being such a great partner. And I want to thank everybody who's joined the call with, and even the people who weren't able to make the call but will access some of the resources we're providing, for your interest in this subject, because as Terry mentioned, it really is a journey. And, I learn more every week, every time I speak to a different organization, different individuals about their lived experience and their insights and examples of things that are actually having an impact. So really, really appreciate those of you who are attending today. And I know some of you have attended other events, but you recognize that this is, as Terry mentioned, a journey, not a destination. So today we really want to talk about maybe I would say a strategic approach to thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion, because for a very, very long time, people thought about it as something that you bolted on to the work that you were doing. And I think our thinking has started to evolve, where we're now regarding it as something that we need to embed in everything that we do. And so I'm going to talk more about how you can start to think of EDI as part of your strategy as an organization, whether you're a hospital, nonprofit, Starbucks, or a startup. And we know that we have to have a particular focus on small, medium enterprises. And as Terry mentioned, a lot of what we hear about equity, diversity, and inclusion tends to be dominated by large organizations, by the banks, by the big IT companies, and so on. Many people forget that in Canada, 90% of private sector employment means 90% of people who work in the private sector work for small, medium enterprises. And as Terry mentioned, often the small, medium enterprises don't have a dedicated HR person, most certainly don't have a dedicated EDI person, may rely very much on informal processes to track employees, are hanging on with their fingernails after COVID and now trying to repay their loans and so on. We have a lot of evidence to suggest that while increasingly small, medium enterprises see the opportunities associated with equity, diversity, and inclusion, they often don't have the resources or the know-how to move things forward, or even to think about where we start, because sometimes it seems incredibly overwhelming. There are different equity deserving groups. You know, do you start with training? Do you start with strategy? Do you start with targets? Do you start with voluntary codes like the 50-30 challenge? And we're going to try to unpack some of that today to really get to practical steps people can take. We will provide some just some introductory stuff on language, and I want very much to respond to questions or concerns or priorities of people in the audience. If you're going to give us an hour and a half of your time, we want to make sure that you go away with as many of your questions answered as we can. And we also have lots and lots of resources that we can refer you to for next steps. So we may not be able to get into all the details, for instance, on, you know, how you look at your policies and ensure that they are sort of leading edge in terms of EDI, but we can refer you to resources that will help you do that. We can refer you to free training that's available on just about anything under the sun. We can, you know, if you want to work with your board on new policies and practices, we've got a catalog basically of things you can draw on. So we really, you know, when we engage in these sorts of training sessions, we don't think that it starts and ends with the 90 minutes we're going to spend together today. We really want to make sure that you have what you need to move things forward in your context, because as Terry said, organizations are at different stages in their development, and the context matters. The sector you're in matters. The size of the organization matters. And so we'll really try to help, if not during the next 90 minutes, then through the follow-up emails and so on with resources that might be helpful. And one of the resources that we've developed, and it's not the only one, and it's not the ultimate solution that we're going to talk about today, is the diversity assessment tool. And really, again, to Terry's point, we developed this because of the work we were doing with small, medium enterprises, where we found that often they didn't have a dedicated HR person. In fact, the person who was drawing up the job descriptions and doing the hiring might also be fixing the computers and taking out the trash. You know, it's when you work in an SME, you do what needs to get done. And so we started by trying to think of how could we provide tools to enable small, medium enterprises to move forward on equity, diversity, and inclusion in the absence of specialized resources. Because we know, you know, large financial institutions will typically have an assistant vice president or vice president of EDI and a team that could be dozens of people or even more. And so we really, in this session today, we'll talk about the whole gamut, but we wanted to especially talk about things that could be useful for small, medium enterprises. And I wanted also, you know, I think Terry did a great job of introducing the Diversity Institute. I just wanted to flag that we do have other resources, many of them free, that we can make available to those of you who want to pursue this. So without further ado, I will try to share my screen. And I will also note that it's a fairly big group, but it's not such a big group that we can't take questions as we go along. I do have trouble managing my slides in the chat. So Sarah and Terry, I think, will help with that. But as we're going forward, please do post questions, comments, examples that you might have in the chat. And as you can see, I can't even get into the chat to see what's in there now. So I'll pause at various points during the presentation. And if there's something where you have a hot pursuit, if you can put up your hand just to draw attention to the fact that you've put something in the chat, please feel free. And you know, I never like to be positioned as an expert on anything, let alone this, because there are lots of people on the call that have more expertise in certain aspects of HR or procurement or product design or whatever. There are people on the call that have lived experience that may or may not align with the research and so on that I have to rely on. So really welcome your engagement to the extent that's possible in a group this size. So the beginning is a good place to start. Quickly, I think you've heard enough about the Diversity Institute, just a couple of points on that. Want to do set context with some definitions and so on. Really want to drill in on the diversity assessment tool, which is free. And you can play around with it if you think it's useful, and some examples of things to date. So both the Diversity Institute, just a couple of things. We have 130 full-time staff who have experience across topics, skills, leadership, entrepreneurship, plain old research, and come from very diverse backgrounds, speak multiple languages, and so on. Probably the most important thing, apart from that capacity, is the fact that we are in the Ted Rogers School of Management. And what that means is, despite the fact that all of us are committed to doing this work because of a deep sense of social justice and a commitment to driving change, we understand that organizations are often preoccupied with their survival, with their business goals. And so everything that we do is very much grounded in that notion that we want to help organizations understand how equity, diversity, and inclusion is not just a nice thing to do or flavor of the month or politically correct. It will actually, in the current environment, which is becoming increasingly diverse, help advance their organizational goals. And I believe that really fundamentally. You know, we've worked with companies like Rogers and Starbucks, we've worked with hospitals, we've worked with healthcare organizations, we've worked with nonprofits, for-profits, big, small, and organizations across the country. And all of them have opportunities to benefit from equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I did want to start with some definitions, and I know, you know, some people refer to EDI, DEI, DE&I, DE and II. There are a lot of different ways organizations are referring to the work that they do in this space. You know, equity, diversity, and inclusion is just one formulation, but the concepts are really important, and it's also important to understand how they're different. So diversity really just refers to difference, and this typically is manifest in demographic characteristics, you know, age, gender, race, religion, and so on. And in Canada, we have legislation and rules that protect people from discrimination based on a wide range of characteristics, but also we have legislation that prioritizes certain segments of the population because of historical disadvantage, discrimination, or even genocide. So diversity just refers to different categories of people, and those are often changing. The acronyms change, the priorities change. Equality is something those of you who are my vintage will remember was very much a focus of the civil rights movement. You know, getting the right to vote, getting the right to drink from the same fountain, getting the right to attend university. All of those were really fundamental parts of the struggle that many people faced. And so the fight for equality really underpinned a lot of the work that we saw, you know, from the turn of the century through to the 60s and 70s. And we still have legislation, of course, that protects us from discrimination, from overt discrimination, from people saying, I'm not going to rent to you because you're Black. I'm not going to give you a job because you're a woman and you're going to have babies, and so on. We have protections against those things, but they still happen. Equity is different than equality. Equality is about treating everybody the same. Equity recognizes historic disadvantage and discrimination, mean that we're not all starting in the same place. And so Canada's employment equity legislation, which was passed in 1986, sets certain demographic groups. In the legislation, it refers to women, visible minorities. We don't use that language anymore. We typically talk about racialized people. It refers to Aboriginal people. We tend not to refer to Aboriginal people now. We talked about Indigenous peoples, and it talks about persons with disabilities, because in 1986, it was felt that those specific demographic groups faced historic disadvantage, racism, and discrimination, which meant that they needed a leg up to be able to participate in a level playing field. So when we talk about employment equity, it really is about trying to correct historic disadvantage. I, for example, got my job at the university formerly known as Ryerson because there was a program targeting the hiring of women in technology where we were underrepresented. And it's allowed under law to specifically target groups that are underrepresented in order to level the playing field. So that would be an example, and often that was referred to as affirmative action. Inclusion is different still. So inclusion really refers to creating environments where everyone feels valued regardless of their demographic characteristics. And so I like this. This is an old diagram, but I still like it as a way of illustrating the difference between equality, everyone's treated the same, equity, where we try to compensate for historic disadvantage, and inclusion, where we remove barriers so everyone feels the same. So I'll just pause there in case there are any questions or comments in the chat or elsewhere that anyone would like me to address at this point. And I will say that it is challenging. The language is changing. So as I mentioned, the employment equity legislation focused on women, racialized people now, we would say, Indigenous peoples, and persons with disabilities. A report has just come out from an expert panel looking at the employment equity legislation, and they specifically have said we should add to those 4 designated groups 2 more. Black people, who currently are included as visible minorities, but the evidence is so clear that Black people are treated categorically different than other racialized people. They should be in their own special category so we can really tackle anti-Black racism. And people who identify as 2S LGBTQ I plus, i.e. people with different sexual orientations and gender identities, because they too face specific forms of discrimination. So there is a recommendation right now that we add 2 categories to the current designated groups. And we know that there's also a need to address, for example, things like Islamophobia and other difference, age within the workplace as well. So any questions or comments on those concepts? Okay, hearing none. Intersectionality is something that is also important to understand, and that is none of us are one thing, right? So, you know, you may look at me and you may say, you're a white woman, but you don't know about my religion. You don't know, you can guess I am of a certain age. You don't know my sexual orientation. You don't know if I identify as someone as a disability, and so on and so forth. So often we have multiple identities, some which are obvious and some which may not be obvious, but the combination of those identities can have a profound impact on our experience. So even if you see someone who looks like a white woman with a disability has a very different experience, opportunities, and so on than a white woman who doesn't have a disability. And when we look at layers of disadvantage and barriers, we know very clearly that someone, for example, who is Black and a woman, who is Black and an immigrant and a woman, who is Black and an immigrant with a disability and a woman, is going to face layers and layers of barriers. And having done a lot of work with Black women, both as entrepreneurs and in leadership roles, sometimes it's hard. If you're facing barriers, sometimes it's hard to figure out, is it because of race or is it because of gender? And, you know, it's clear that these are things that we have to continually address. And it's part of the reason why we know that gender's not done. You know, some people act like gender's not done. I'll show you the data. Gender's not done. But we also have to recognize, for instance, that the opportunities that white women have are categorically different than the opportunities that other women have, and so on and so forth. And, you know, the example that really opened my eyes was research that we did on leadership in the Greater Toronto Area. So in the Greater Toronto Area, half the population's women. Half the population now is racialized. In fact, it's a bit more than 50%. So for every white woman, there's a racialized woman. And yet when you look in leadership roles, white women outnumber racialized women by a factor of 12 to 1, meaning for every 12 white women, there's one racialized woman, even though in the population it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So this intersectional lens is very, very important. And that's part of the reason why I'm thrilled that WXN has really embraced this notion and taken a cold, hard look at its nomination processes, its selection processes, and so on, to ensure that it truly is acknowledging women across demographic groups. So if we think about the context, I've already sort of addressed this, but it's really important to recognize from a business perspective that the environment is changing. And if the environment is changing, you know, partly because the boomers like me are retiring or dying and making space for a lot of different people, including immigrants. And I'm more than happy to talk about some of the debates about immigration right now. But it's very clear that as the environment is changing, as the demographics are changing, markets are changing. So new opportunities, different opportunities. to develop and sell products. And the talent pool is changing. So if think about the city of Toronto, half the population's racialized, half the population's women. You're only focusing on white men. You're missing out on 75% of the talent pool. So to me, this is just good business sense to understand how markets are changing. And we are also seeing expectations change. So, investors are starting to look at these issues. Regulators are starting to look at these issues. Customers, large and small, are looking at these issues. It's not just consumers who care about equity, diversity, and inclusion. We're seeing more and more organizations embrace diversity in their procurement policies, where they're setting aside portions of their spend to be targeted at specific groups, and we'll talk more about that later. Certainly, I don't know if any of you apply for government grants, but we're seeing more and more. And this isn't just the federal government. This is the city of Calgary. This is the city of London. Cities, provinces, I think BC is probably one of the most advanced, are starting to ask questions when you apply for grants about your equity, diversity, and inclusion practices. We applied for a grant to do work with I think it was the Calgary Police Service. There were a lot of questions about how we not only talked about equity, diversity, and inclusion, but what did we actually do about it? And so there are really good business reasons why we need to look at some of this. And I've already talked about the highlights of some of our work in terms of tracking women and racialized people and people who are Black in leadership roles. And we have a couple of really interesting, eye-opening reports coming out over the next little while, updating some of this, but stay tuned. We also know progress is unquestionably encouraging us. And we know that certain sectors are far ahead of others in terms of representation. So you can see pretty well all sectors are increasing. Many have doubled the representation of women on their boards. But you can see there are huge differences between, for example, federally regulated sectors, financial services, and things like life sciences or mining. We also know that despite the progress that is being made, it really is a pyramid. And even though women are almost half of the total workforce and their representation in management and on boards is growing, they're still really underrepresented as CEOs. And every year I hope and pray there will be change. And every year out comes the top paid 100 CEOs in Canada. And for the last few years, it's been getting worse, not better. So last list of 100 top paid CEOs in Canada, there were more men named Mark than there were women. There were exactly four women out of 100 in that list. And you see the underrepresentation, when you hear about the wage gap and the fact that women earn about 86 cents on the dollar for men, a lot of that does have to do with the pyramid. We're down at the lower levels, working our butts off, but we're not making it into the higher paid jobs. There's also what we would call occupational segregation. So even though I've worked on women in technology for over 30 years, there are fewer women in computer science and only marginally more in engineering today than there were when I started. Women are now the majority of medical school students, I think, and law students, which is a big change, huge progress. But in some areas, not much has changed. And so, when we move beyond the gender issues, certainly the study that my colleagues were involved in a number of years ago hasn't changed, where when they anonymize, they took resumes, they put a quote, foreign sounding last name on one version and a non-foreign sounding last name on the other. And those with the foreign sounding last names were much less likely to get called back for interviews. And that's a clear indication of bias and discrimination in the system. We know, and this is one of the things that horrifies me working at a university, we know that university graduates with severe disabilities have poorer employment outcomes than high school dropouts without disabilities. Just think about that for a moment. Someone gets through university and their employment prospects are no better than somebody who dropped out of high school if they have a severe disability. And normally, if you look, for example, at Indigenous people, if you compare Indigenous peoples with a university degree and non-Indigenous peoples with a university degree, there's not a lot of difference in the employment outcomes, which tells us one of the things we have to really focus on for Indigenous peoples, you know, and it's in the Truth and Reconciliation report, is education, because it's not a guarantee, but it's more likely to advance your success economically. Not true for people with severe disabilities. So just think about that, and you know, maybe we can talk about it further. It's also, as I mentioned, you know, we still see underrepresentation of women in engineering, and even when they get through engineering and they get a job, they get paid less, and often they drop out of the workforce because of toxic environments. And it's getting better. You know, I started my career in with a bunch of engineers with sunshine girls on the wall, and they took me out for lunch once to a strip joint to just see what I would do. And they used to talk about, you know, women's anatomy as they walked by. It was a horror show. I don't think it's that bad today, but we still see, you know, rampant sexual harassment and microaggressions and all kinds of things in these environments. You just read the newspaper and we know we still have a long way to go. Pay gaps, I mentioned that, you know, there's still pay gaps. Women are still earning less than men. Sorry, I said 86%, 89 cents on the dollar. But when you add in those intersectional identities, you can see it drops really dramatically. And I've talked about the leadership issues. So all of this is occurring at the same time that large and small employers are saying they're having trouble recruiting skilled employees. So on the one hand, we have underemployment, underpayment, underrepresentation of women, racialized people, and so on. And at the same time, we have lots of SMEs saying, we really need employees. And I see that as creating a massive opportunity. In fact, you know, I was taking my car in to have it fixed in a local community, small town. And the guy was complaining about, you know, how hard it was to get employees. And he was telling me a story about someone who came and played on their phone all day and, you know, didn't work very hard. And I said, well, you know, have you thought about newcomers? Because there are lots of people coming to Canada who are really interested in finding work. And we run a number of programs for refugees, newcomers, and so on. And he said, absolutely. He said, you know, send them on. We will give anybody a chance. And what we're seeing is this imperative to fill the labor shortages is opening doors for newcomers, for others. It's getting organizations to rethink, do I really need someone with a computer science degree or an engineering degree? If it's to develop applications that are kind of low code, no code, or to help users adopt technology, we're seeing lots of evidence that employers are starting to rethink what they always assumed was required in hiring. And that's creating opportunities for women in non-traditional jobs. It's creating opportunities for other groups. And, you know, the issues of the skill shortage are across the board. There's virtually no sector that is immune to this. And when it comes to small, medium enterprises, it's having a profound impact on productivity. And that brings me to the issue of, we can talk about it more, but the issue of immigration. People are saying, oh, there are too many immigrants, and everybody's seen the graph that the Globe and the National Post have been publishing that shows this staggering increase in immigration. What they aren't explaining is that during COVID, it was frozen. So in effect, the high immigration rate in last year was really making up to a large extent for that massive dip the year before where we had none. And what's also interesting is we're having a whole bunch of SMEs saying, no, cut back. We need those temporary foreign workers. No. We still have jobs we can't fill. It's a larger discussion, but if in fact immigration was driving everything that ails us, we would see Canada suffering compared to other countries in the world. The housing shortage is in the US. The housing shortage is in the UK. The housing shortage, quite honestly, is not just a function of immigration. And when we look at things like inflation, think about it. If you don't have workers, if you don't have people to pick the produce and operate the factory lines, the price of food goes up and up. And it was CIBC, I think, that just published a report that showed, in fact, the higher levels of immigration are helping manage inflation. It seems like prices are really going up, but think about it. If more and more companies can't employ workers, those prices are going to go even higher through the roof. So it's a broader discussion, and I've oversimplified it. But I just want to say that at this point, businesses are having trouble finding workers. Unemployment is at historically low levels, means that we need people. We need to broaden the talent pool. We need immigrants. We need women. We need people with disabilities. We need Indigenous peoples and racialized people being employed to their full potential to address what is a very real economic problem. And so, basically the case for diversity is that economic argument, that it's the talent pool, it's responding to changes in the market, it's ensuring that leadership looks like the people who are being led, because there's lots of evidence to suggest that employee engagement and retention is very much tied to who you see at the top, because who you see, if you can't see it, you can't be it. There's also evidence that having more diversity fosters new ways of thinking about things, creativity and innovation. And of course, it helps mitigate risks, because I sit on a lot of boards and we have risk registers. We talk about, cybersecurity risk, and financial risk, and legal risk. You screw up on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and a brand that you spent decades building can be destroyed very, very quickly. So there are lots of good business reasons for really digging in on this. And I'm just going to jump ahead through these next slides. You'll have access to the slides with more examples of how these things play out. And I'll just quote Warren Buffett, who says, it takes 20 years to build a reputation, and you can lose it in 5 minutes. And just think about some of the high profile missteps around equity, diversity, and inclusion that we've seen in recent years, and what that's done to organizations' reputations. So before I go on to the next section, I'm just going to pause here because I see lots of stuff in the chat, and see if Sarah and Terry want to add any comments, questions that have come up.
There's a lot of discussion, happening in the chat about various different recruitment strategies and wondering how to measure benchmarks. But is that our next session, Wendy? I can't remember where we're at. I'm sorry. Benchmarks and
the next section, I'm going to talk about the diversity assessment tool.
Perfect.
And we'll dig in on that a little bit. But basically, what we're seeing progressive organizations do with recruitment is say that the short list has to include, you know, at least one woman or at least one racialized person, depending on the context. You know, there's a big difference between being in St. John's, Newfoundland, and being in downtown Toronto. So that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is, does the pool of applicants represent the population that you're serving? If it doesn't, maybe there's something about your brand or your organization that needs to be addressed. Maybe you need more targeted outreach. And certainly we've seen this with organizations like the police or firefighting, where there are sort of historic issues that have prevented certain segments of the population from applying. And certainly when we look at technology companies, often if the word technology is in the ad, women won't apply, even if the role is not primarily technological. And I know this for a fact because I used to teach in a school called Administration and Information Management. We changed our curriculum. We added one course, a programming course. So out of 40 courses, we added one programming course, but we changed the name to Information Technology Management. And in 1 year, we went from over 60% women applicants to 30. Even though the program changes were minimal, people were learning about organizations, they were learning about technology when they were in administration and information management, were doing technology things, systems analysis and design and so on. Changing the title basically dried up our pool of women applicants. I know, and conversely, I know of a case of a small business in, I think it was Kingston, put out a job ad. No one really having problems, and then they'd be ghosted. So they'd find applicants and then they wouldn't show up the interviews. One change to the job application. Internationally educated professionals welcome. Not only did they triple the number of job applicants, but they improved the quality substantially because they sent out a signal, right, that their doors were open to diverse people. If you look at some of the advertisements, and these are for you know, entry-level jobs, but I think it was McDonald's and Tim Hortons have been running ads on television. That tells you something about how bad the labor shortage is, trying to get people to apply for jobs. And they're being very strategic about who is in those pictures. They're being very strategic about the messaging they're delivering about why you want to come and work for the company. So recruiting has become almost as important a marketing activity today because of the labor shortages as selling your product. I'll pause there. Is there anything in the chat though that
that's what really this theme was, really about that recruitment piece. Other than that, just a lot of discussion about what you're saying and how it's still happening, and a lot of frustration about the more marks than women. So definitely an interesting topic. So I'll let you get back to the presentation, and we'll keep an eye on that chat.
Fantastic. So now I want to dig in on the meat of the presentation. And as I said, I'm a professor, I talk too much. So if I don't get through all the material, there's lots of backup. You'll get access to the slides and so on. But the diversity assessment tool was really designed, and it's only one application or tool, but it's an online application which has strengths and weaknesses that allows you to answer a bunch of questions, get some recommendations and some examples of what you could do. And it's organized around these 6 pillars. So governance, leadership, and strategy, that has a lot to do with your board and your senior executive roles. Human resources policies, everyone talks about those. Values and culture, that's well understood. how you measure and track your progress. And this is not just about representation. It's also about employee engagement, where you have disaggregated data so you know about differences between the men and the women in the organization, or the racialized people and those who are identify as not racialized, and so on. And your procurement, who do you spend your money on? And your corporate social responsibility, if you're in an organization big enough to hand out grants to the community, where's that money going? So there's a lot more to tracking and measuring EDI than just what you might think of with respect to human resources. Where I think the real power of the diversity assessment tool is in digging into your value chain. So actually looking at, you know, have you thought about the design of your products? Are you using inclusive design in your services? We all know the stories, and I'll talk about them more later, about, you know, motor vehicle safety systems being tested with male anatomy crash test dummies. As a result, more women die in car crashes and are injured because the systems didn't have a gender lens applied. You know, voice recognition systems that didn't work for women. One that I learned about recently, the hand washing systems didn't work for people with black skin, and so on and so on. So actually thinking about your products and your services and the supports through an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens works whether you're Starbucks, Rogers, a bank, a hospital, a university, and it's very, very powerful to start digging in on that. And then your relationships, how you engage with community groups, and so on. So tone at the top is critical, and the diversity assessment tool tries to dig in not just to the issues about representation, but the kinds of policies you have, whether or not you've addressed equity, diversity, and inclusion in your mission, whether you think about it as part of your strategy. And we're big proponents of the 50-30 challenge, which is like the 30% Club or the Black North Initiative, a voluntary code where organizations sign up and basically say, we aspire to having 50% women and 30% representation of equity deserving groups in our leadership roles. And so I'll talk more about that. And we have lots of resources for those of you who are interested. But basically, it looks at gender parity. So that's women and non-binary people. That's the 50%. And then significant representation, which is the 30% of other equity deserving groups. That would be racialized people, Indigenous people, those who identify as 2S LGBTQ+, as well as persons with disabilities. And what I love about this is it's flexible. So the 30%, if you're in Toronto, is likely to look different from the 30% if you're in Regina, because Toronto has very high racialized population. Regina probably doesn't, but Regina would have a higher percentage of Indigenous peoples in the population. So it allows for flexibility, and it also allows, so think about a board, 10 people on the board. If it has 5 women, and one of the women is racialized, and 2 of the women identify as women with disabilities, it's 50 and it's 30. So it's not like you have to have 50% women or non-binary people plus 30% diversity. You can have diverse women that will help you meet the challenge. And it's aspirational. So you can sign up to state your intention to move in that direction. Doesn't mean that you have to provide evidence that you're there. And what it does is give you access to tools and resources and free stuff to help move things forward. We also think that, you know, you need to think about your senior management team. And one of the big functions of a board in an organization that has a board, lots don't, if you don't have a board, no problem, is the board typically hires the senior management team. And so thinking about that and the impact that that has. Think about the extent to which the senior most people in the organization communicate the importance of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And Rocco Rossi, I don't know if people here know him, was the head of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce for the last, I don't know, maybe 8 years, something like that, recently retired. And the thing I remember most about Rocco, who is a very tall white man of Italian descent, is that he said repeatedly, childcare is not a women's issue. Childcare is an economic issue. Okay, so the power of someone in a leadership role, and the Ontario Chamber of Commerce is 60,000 small businesses and other organizations across the province. The power of a very tall white man talking about the importance of childcare, in my view, was very, very, very significant. And same thing for the organizations that have signed on to the Black North Initiative, really signaling allyship and commitments to creating more inclusive places for people who identify as Black. It also has to be, when you're thinking, if you're serious about it, you think about how you bake this into your performance targets. And a lot of big organizations like banks will actually have diversity related performance indicators in the performance plans for their senior managers. So there's lots that can be done in terms of tone at the top to drive things forward. And we have lots of examples of organizations that have put in place measures to establish better representation of women. I mean, there's over 250 large corporations have signed on to the 30% club, where they committed to 30%. We did an analysis of companies traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange that showed those who signed up to the 30% club had much higher levels of representation than those that did not. So often, by stating your intentions publicly, by starting to measure and track, you will move things forward. Things like board diversity policies. I'm not going to go through this stuff in great detail, but the diversity assessment tool, as I said, basically will ask you the questions. It will then do an assessment of where you are and make recommendations. Sort of, do you have a skills matrix for your board? No, we don't have a skills matrix for your board. You should have a skills matrix for your board. Here is an example of a skills matrix for your board. And I think it's that final piece. Here is an example that is so powerful, because I'm a really good monkey. If you give me something, I can copy it. If you just said to me, you should have a skills matrix, what's that? What am I going to do? So I think part of the power of this is not just the diagnostic that you get a nice little, it's like, anyone done those online horoscopes? It's a little bit the same. You're a Sagittarius, your moon is in Venus and something else, and this is what you're like. It's similar, but the power is in the examples, so that I'm just giving you a few. You want a board diversity policy? We've got examples you can look at and adapt. You want a skills matrix? Starbucks, we worked with them on their EDI strategy. They actually track and measure representation on their board across a whole variety of different dimensions, so that they can make sure that their board represents the people they're serving. With human resources, there's a whole series of things in there, starting with job definition. And I say this because often we think, well, a job's a job. If I want to hire someone to do X, they have to have Y in terms of their qualifications. Yet sometimes if you actually dig in, you'll see that the assumptions about the qualifications and the credentials required don't really align with the jobs anymore. And I say this in particular because I'm still sort of work in the IT sector, where it was for a long time assumed you had to be a computer scientist or an engineer. I had a master's degree in medieval history when I got into the sector. What I was really good at was listening carefully and translating what the technology people said into terms that humans could understand and could see aligned with their goals and objectives. It was a translation role. And those translation roles, I would argue, are more important today than the people who build the technologies, because we have lots of technologies, whether we're talking about green tech or ICT, that aren't being used because of that missing translation piece. So it's very important, in my view, to really think about what the requirements are to succeed in the job. And the example I always use, when I was growing up, to be a police officer, you had to be 5'10". Why? Why? Exactly. Has nothing to do with fitness, has nothing to do with anything other than maybe they look taller, people look better in uniforms, but it had the unintended consequence of excluding people who were either shorter or were from ethnic groups that tended to have lower average heights. And it was, you know, really good for people from Northern Europe who tended to be 6'5". But it made no sense in terms of what was required for the job. And I would argue, if you do an analysis of jobs, very often people are hiring in their own image. I'm a medieval historian, so everyone I hire must have medieval history. Or they hire people who remind them of themselves or whatever, and that's not always needed. And we're seeing increasingly, for example, in the IT sector, companies saying, maybe you don't need a university degree because you can learn a lot of this stuff on the fly. So lots of critical thinking about what you're actually asking for in the roles. You know, when you say you have to have had experience doing X, really? Or is that something, you know, maybe you would like to have somebody who had 5 years experience doing exactly what they're going to be doing in the new role, but maybe they could actually learn it on the job. So thinking more creatively about how you structure the roles, I think, becomes important. Thinking about your selection processes and your recruitment. You know, a lot of organizations will have a bad reputation. We did some work with Security Canada, trying to figure out, well, not trying to figure out, we kind of knew why, but they were trying to come up with a strategy to attract more diverse people to the RCMP, CSIS, et cetera, kind of a big hill to climb, but they had to really give some intentional thought to what their outreach strategies were, to who people were going to see at the job fairs, right? Because if they don't see people like them, they're much less likely to think that this is a role for them. So really important to think about recruitment, selection. We could talk endlessly about the flaws of some of the interview processes that organizations use. You know, extroverts who are confident, operating in their first language and so on, are more likely to do well in interviews. So are psychopaths, you know, because they'll tell you exactly what you want to hear. So are actors, but doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to translate into job performance. So, you know, one of the things we've done at the Diversity Institute is think more about occupational testing. Like, what is the job the person's going to do? Right? If the job the person's going to do is write research reports and edit articles, maybe we should test the writing skill rather than their ability to charm us and tell us jokes and make us laugh in an interview, because not so important. So lots of stuff there. We have lots of examples of how to create tools and processes to be more inclusive, and lots of examples of how other organizations do this. I was in a selection committee, for instance, where we actually had a cheat sheet about how unconscious bias can shape how we treat people. You know, men are more often judged based on potential, women on their track record, and so on. And it actually, in the training session, we were told we should call out our colleagues if we observed something that appeared to be unfair. So part of the training wasn't just you need to know what the stuff is, but you need to take responsibility for making sure the process is inclusive. And lots of examples, large, small, of organizations and that have strategies and techniques in place. We know that culture is really critical, and a lot of people say, well, culture, what's that? I think it was Drucker who said culture eats strategy, and it is very hard to get your hand around culture because it's values, its beliefs, and so on. But one of the ways to assess culture in organizations is employee engagement surveys. The percentage of people who self-identify, and you have to include demographic data, because there are two things. What proportion of the people who fill in the survey self-identify? If it's low, that tells you they don't feel safe. That's really important to know. And then the second thing is, are there differences you can observe in the data between the people who identify as women and men and white and racialized and so on and so forth? So employee engagement surveys can be really powerful as ways of assessing culture. And then you also have to look at your policies and your practices, because those shape as well as reflect culture. And, policies around family leave, mental health, all of those things signal what an organization really values. And I often argue that one of the things that is critically important is to ensure that men take parental leave. Because if men take parental leave, it signals that this is something that parents do, not just women. And lots of examples of how to make those commitments. As I said, measurement is important. Having metrics for all of these things is key. You need to treat the elements of your EDI strategy the way you would a marketing strategy. And what troubles me is very often organizations default to training. We did unconscious bias training. Training is the least effective way of changing behavior. It's important, but if you don't have the structures and the policies and the values in the organization, the training is not going to produce the results that you're hoping for. And so you have to have clear objectives, and the objectives need to have measurement associated with them. And the measurements are not just around what percentage of women are in senior roles. You can also measure things like wage gaps. The universities got nailed because there were huge gaps between what women and men professors were getting paid. And in fact, at my university, there was an average that they worked on for men versus the average for women. And I remember going in to see a senior person and saying, this woman's our top researcher. And he pulled out a graph and he said, oh yeah, but she's average for women. What does that mean? Like, how could you possibly justify that? So keeping track of who gets paid, pay transparency, stuff like that's important. Participation, as I said, in employee surveys, self-identification rates, and rankings on employee engagement survey by demographic group, really important. I remember talking to one organization. They said, oh, we have an 86% satisfaction rate among our employees. They had 10% of the employees who were Black. And I said, like, if you haven't done that analysis, maybe the 86% is all your white employees who think the place is awesome. And maybe the 10% who are your Black employees are saying not so much. So that disaggregated data for gender, for race, for other demographics, for occupational areas, and so on becomes very important. CBC, and many other organizations that are federally regulated track representation or the diversity elements, as well as other dimensions. CBC also tracks representation in their news broadcasts and their programming because they recognize that their products and services have to align with the communities that they're serving. And so there's lots of these examples that I can provide you, but basically the diversity assessment tool will look at your scores and your responses in all of the categories. And rather than saying you're good, better, and different, it will say this is where you are on the journey. You know, in these areas, you've taken some baby steps, and in these areas, you're very advanced and it's integrated. And then you can set goals and objectives accordingly. I'll just pause there to see if there are any more comments or questions on what I've just gone through.
And I do have somebody asking how you define senior management when you are talking about the 50-30 challenge.
That's a really good question, and it's kind of a trick question because I know that, for example, when the employment equity legislation came out, and organizations were asked to report on representation at different levels, a lot of the banks created like 100 new vice presidents so that they would look better. But generally, senior management is viewed as kind of the equivalent of the C-suite. So it would be more the vice president level than the manager level, but it would depend a little bit on how your organization's structured. If you're an SME, you probably don't have lots of layers. So, you know, to me, it would be the CEO and a group of people who report to the CEO, whether those are called directors, managers, or VPs, would be a bit context specific. But for the purposes of the 50-30 challenge, you define what makes sense in your context.
Great. And then I think you've already answered this one by showing the what the diversity assessment tool can do, but someone was asking about best practices and guidelines and performance indicators that they should be targeting when recruiting and when looking at their employees and their organization. But it sounds like the diversity assessment tool will help with a lot with this.
Certainly, it depends on, you know, and if you're digging in more deeply, for instance, on what used to be referred to as the pipeline analysis, it may or may not spit it out, but if somebody had very specific concerns or interests, we'd be happy to follow. And the idea of pipeline analysis is you don't just track EDI in the employee pool or the leadership pool. You look at the applicants, you look at who is shortlisted, you track all the way through the process to try to figure out, if you don't have representation, where the blockage is. And there was a study done, for example, in the federal government that showed that the applicant pool had a healthy proportion of Black individuals. And when they went through the first stage screening, they stayed in. When they got to the interview stage, suddenly they fell off. And so if you have that kind of analysis, you know where the levers are to drive change.
Amazing. That seems to be all so far. So we can turn it back over to you for a little bit more before we have to wrap up. It's been fast.
Yes, I will finish on time. So this is the piece that I think is different from the diversity assessment tool and other things. Most organizations do talk about HR. They do talk about culture. They do talk about, they might talk about representation and leadership and so on. But I think that the kind of final frontier in this work is actually digging into your operations. So this is, those of you who have MBAs, this is adapted from Michael Porter's value chain, which is one of the few things I remember from my MBA in 1986. And I think it's very powerful because you can apply it, even though it was designed sort of to talk about manufacturing. You can apply it to healthcare, you can apply it to education. And basically it just says is break your organization down into the function. So you have a bunch of support stuff. You have procurement policies, HR, infrastructure, and so on that you can look at. but think about what are your raw materials? Okay. And if you're a manufacturer, it's, steel and electricity and water or something. If you're Starbucks, it's going to be, coffee and treats and something else. If you're a university, it's going to be primarily people, and because the faculty and the, curriculum design and so on are so core. If you're a hospital, it's going to be a variety of the things you use to support clinical practice, education service, and so on. So think about what you're bringing into the organization, the raw materials, and so on. Then think about what you do in terms of design. When you think about products and services, are you only thinking about men? Are you only thinking about white people? Are you only thinking about white men born in Canada? Have you really considered the needs and requirements more broadly? And this applies not just to big corporations, but startups as well. And my favorite example, apologies if you've heard it before, but I tell it all the time. I don't know if anyone's been to the Island Airport recently, but I remember there was a company and the woman founder pitched over and over and over to men, venture capitalists and angels, and they kind of went, don't see it. The product was pantyhose that do not run. The company was Sheertex, and Sheertex is now everywhere, and a big success story. But it was like the guys just didn't see where the opportunity was. And so you really need to dig right into your actual products and services, regardless of your sector, and ask the question about, are we understanding the market is diverse? And are we seeing all the opportunities? Are we using inclusive design practices to make sure that whatever it is we're making serves different segments of the population? I remember someone gave me an example of a handset that was so big most women couldn't use it. Stuff like that. Then how are you thinking about your marketing and sales? It's not just who you're marketing and selling to, it's what images do you have? What language are you using? There's a whole thing around inclusive marketing and sales that you can address. And then service, customer service. Are you really thinking about the diversity among your customers? And I can say as an older woman or a woman of a certain age, that I'm seeing more and more attention being focused on issues around age and providing specialized services. So lots of examples of how you can apply this to your procurement practices. And the final stage is this outreach and expanding the pool and who you partner with. Who are your community organizations? Where do you do the volunteer work? Where do you donate? Which schools do you go to? If you go to the Ivy League or the U15 equivalents, chances are you're going to be hiring in your own image. And I know, university formerly known as Ryerson was always disadvantaged, even though we were the most diverse institution, because the more established universities were often the places people went for summer students and so on. So lots and lots that can be done there. And I just wanted to say, where we are currently with the diversity assessment tool is over 230 organizations have used it. It's free. You go online, you answer some questions. It just gives you the tools. And we are more than happy to help organizations beyond the, off the shelf stuff. And if you have specific questions or needs, let us know. But this was kind of interesting. An organization came in, they did the diversity assessment tool, and they were scoring pretty badly, minimal compliance in everything. A month later, this is where they were, right? What happened? By what gets measured gets done. They looked at what they were doing They looked at what they weren't doing. There was lots of stuff that was easy to do. We need a policy on this. We need language on that. We need to add something into our job ads, right? So this is not rocket science. This does not depend on spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in years. You can make changes really quickly if you look in the right places. And so we have lots of stuff that we are more than happy to share. The government of Canada has invested many, many, many millions of dollars to try to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so we have lots of stuff that we can provide you with. And there are a lot of other organizations that are out there to help as well. So thank you very much. And any final questions before you wrap up?
I do have, there's actually a couple in here, but definitely get one in there. And if anything else, I will make sure to pull and maybe send your way, Wendy, and we can get the answers out hopefully soon. So this one says there has been a fair amount of noise and pushback on diversity, particularly in the US, leading many organizations to pull back on their commitment and plans on DEI. Can you comment on the reasons behind the pushback, particularly in Canada? Because it's a worrying trend as the statistics show that very little progress is being made.
I think that's such an important point. And we actually did a whole session on backlash and how to deal with it. And I'm more than happy to share that. All I can say is there is so much misinformation that, and the US, a lot of the US stuff we're seeing is spilling over into Canada. I, however, am quite confident that given our legislative frameworks, our values, and our history, we are not as vulnerable to the rollbacks as they are on some things. The employment equity legislation, as far as I can tell, is not going anywhere. None of the political parties have suggested getting rid of employment equity, getting rid of human rights. The thing that is currently under attack, in my view, and certainly not childcare. No one's going after childcare. The thing that's definitely under attack is immigration. And I think that a lot of it is misdirected and blaming immigrants for things that have nothing to do with immigration, as I said previously. So I always fall back on the silent majority is generally supportive of Canadian values, which include equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we have to speak out. We have to be allies. We can't be silent because, you know, the culture of silence, in my view, is one of the things that allows loud but minority voices to gain ground. So it's sessions like this and organizations like WXN that I think will help protect us, but we really need everybody pulling together.
And we might have time for one more question. In spite of the many that are in the chats, like I said, I'll gather them together and send them your way. But this one, I think, hopefully we'll be able to cover with the last minute or so we have left. So how would you suggest starting a conversation with the board about EDI where they feel it might be a check mark versus a sound business organizational principle?
So really good question. And honestly, the angle we've been taking, and it comes out of our work with the governance professionals of Canada, and happy to share the stuff, risk. Boards are worried about risk. Why you need to care about EDI is because of risk. Here are examples of risk, and here are examples of benefits and opportunities. I really think that digging into the business case for your organization, how this relates to your changing markets, how this relates to expectations from consumers, government, and so on. I think that's the way to open the conversation. It's not about being politically correct. It's being about success.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Wendy. And I will gather the rest of the questions from the chat. If you have any remaining ones that you have that you'd like to get in there, feel free. Wendy, thank you so much.
It was really a pleasure. And as I said, I think there'll be a follow-up survey with some resources, my email. We have 130 full-time staff at your disposal. So anything we can do to help you, we will definitely help with.
I'm going to pass it to Gary now.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and all of those wonderful tools and resources. Let's hear it for Wendy. She is such an inspiring force for change. If you'd like to explore more of what the Diversity Institute has to offer, you can find them online at torontomu.ca/diversity. And if you're interested in exploring more of our research and reports at WXN, you can find us at wxnetwork.com. This includes our FP500 report Terry mentioned at the top of the event, digging into the representation of women at the top levels of leadership in corporate Canada, and our EDI-B interim report, which explores topics like effective versus performative allyship, burnout in EDI roles, the impact of employee resource groups, using data to your advantage in talent recruitment, and featuring Wendy herself, supporting organizations along their EDI path. We'll have more exciting news to share soon about our EDI research series as well, so be sure to follow us on social media. That's at WXN on X, formerly known as Twitter, at WX Network on Instagram, and at WXN Events on Facebook. If you enjoyed today's session and you'd like to continue building your EDI strategy, we have another webinar with the Diversity Institute coming up on February 22nd, exploring EDI metrics and employee engagement surveys. I can't recommend this next one enough, as we'll dive into the must-track metrics, overcome the challenges of measuring EDI in your organization, and tap into a tool chest full of resources that'll help you navigate your path ahead, wherever you are right now. And as we continue the EDI conversation, mark your calendars for the end of May, because our 2024 Canadian Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Summit and Awards are on the horizon. CEDI is your chance to connect with other EDI practitioners and tackle the pressing issues that Canadian organizations face with regards to increasing the representation of women and underrepresented groups across all levels of leadership. WXN is currently accepting nominations for the CEDI Awards as well, recognizing the leading voices and change makers who put and keep EDI on the agenda. So if you, someone you work with, or someone you know is an EDI champion on a mission to make waves of change across their organization, we want to hear about them. Nominations close on February 6th, so be sure to check that out on our website too. With that, I'd like to thank Wendy and the Diversity Institute once again for taking the time to share this knowledge and insight with us. They work tirelessly to help us create actionable and meaningful programming like this. And I'd like to thank all of you for your participation with us today. When we share a path like this, and when we can learn from each other's journeys, we create real change. I look forward to seeing you all again soon.
We do have a few things coming up, and as Gary mentioned, we have a follow-up session on February 22nd. The link for the event will be in the follow-up email. It is on our website as well, where you found this one in there. So hopefully we will see some of you back that day as well. And we mentioned our Canadian Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Awards. Those nominations close on February 6th. If you would like to become a WXN member, you also have access to our Monday Mojo sessions. They are facilitated discussions by our ambassadors. They are 3 Mondays a month. We have had one in January and have 2 more to come. Come start your Mondays with us. Our memberships are $150 a month, or sorry, $150 a year or $12.50 a month. There are a lot of benefits. If you are interested in learning about memberships, you can either visit our website or you can email me, soakley@wxnetwork.com. I'd be happy to help you. We thank our partners, of which Diversity Institute is one. Without them, we wouldn't be able to run the programming we run. So thank you to all of you. Thank you, and we hope to see you again at a session soon.